this story kind of comes full circle for us, but we'll start it with the frantic phone calls we were getting in 2017 from particularly the American media that Conor McGregor was going to be killed by the Kinahan cartel and that he'd left the country, he'd gone to ground. There'd been this bust up in a pub and his father had been punched in the face or his father had been threatened or something. And McGregor was in the sights of Daniel Kinahan.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. Like, I think we first published a picture of Graham The Wig Whelan in 2010 with a chip up his nose.
That's
remember
right.
The picture?
I do remember the picture,
again
yeah.
and again.
Why did he have a chip up his nose?
Well, this is a mystery that remains unsolved. But so that's
one of those cases that your mother would say to you, don't do that because the wind will change and you'll be left like that.
Exactly. So little did you know, 7 years later,
yeah,
that would be the only picture of Graham The Wig Whelan, and that would become a focus of literally thousands of YouTube, MMA specialists, UFC websites, all focusing in on poor old Graham Whelan with a chip up his
because
nose.
Of course the story was that Graham Whelan had got into some sort of a set too, and that he had been either run from the pub or something, and he was furious and he was going to come back to get his revenge.
The basic story was Conor McGregor had been involved in a row with a man known to Graham Whelan, and that there'd been a bit of a set to, and that Graham Whelan was furious and he was coming after Conor McGregor with all the might of the Kinahan cartel behind him.
And I'd say like those American journalists thought there's something wrong with us because like I remember kind of laughing down the phone to a few of them going, he'll be grand, sure, Conor. Sure, they know Conor. They wouldn't touch him. And they're like, oh my God. So anyway, onwards.
He lived through it.
Basically. So we'll bring it full circle and then we'll go back a bit. So story this week in the Sunday World was a picture.
Yeah. A picture of Graham The Wig Whelan with Conor McGregor's sister, who are now in a relationship. Graham The Wig Whelan has just been released from prison in just a couple of months ago in December after serving a 18-month sentence for money laundering offences connected with the activities of the Kinahan cartel. Graham The Wig Whelan, of course, has been, in the papers for drug-related crime since the
infamous... He took a chip up his nose.
With a chip up his nose since the infamous drugs bust in the Holiday Inn, which we've spoken about many times, and which, that seizure of drugs and the blame that was attached split a gang and ended up causing the Crumlin Drimnagh feud. So Graham Whelan has been a serious criminal for that long.
So that was like, in around 1.5 million euro worth of cocaine that was being cut up in the Holiday Inn hotel. And Graham The Wig Whelan.
He was only a 17-year-old at the time. There was probably more senior criminals there, but there was
three criminals there. There was Graham The Wig Whelan, there was Declan Gavin, who was subsequently murdered, and there was Graham The Wig Whelan's friend.
Yeah, Griffiths. So who tragically passed away in recent times as well. So
Whelan and Griffiths were found with their hands on the drugs. Gavin was having a lie down in a neighbouring room and was blamed for telling the police, blamed in the whole thing. And what kicked off was the Crumlin Drimnagh feud. Brian Rattigan killed
Brian
Declan
Rattigan
Gavin.
Blamed Declan Gavin for this loss. The other side of the feud backed Declan Gavin, and then ultimately it split with Frat Freddie Thompson becoming the main protagonist against Brian Rattigan
after Gavin's death.
So
that was that. So that's how far back and how significant a figure, I suppose, Graham Whelan was.
He sort of earned this respect, I think, as well for how he did his time and didn't make a fuss. And he did, I think it was 6 years in prison for that. When he came out, he became heavily involved in crime and really became part of he was a childhood friend of Liam and David Byrne. Liam and David Byrne are obviously connected through family to Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, And Graham The Wig Whelan became one of the more serious players
in that grouping.
In that grouping.
Which would ultimately become the sort of the Dublin stroke Ireland entity of the Kinahan Mafia.
Yeah, and Graham The Wig Whelan was back and forth to Thomas Bomber Kavanagh over in Birmingham. If there was an attempt to actually charge him at one point here in Ireland with directing criminal organisation. We reported at the time a file was sent to the DPP. No charges were ever brought.
So that would have been after 2009 when that gangland legislation came in.
Yeah, so that was sort of in the early part of the last decade.
Yeah.
It never happened. He then seemed to end up over in Birmingham, where he was really operating as a sort of right-hand man of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. And then he sort of...
They feared that legislation for a while, didn't they? Because, of course, it sort of mirrored what was there for a long time for the terrorists, because you'd often see membership of those terrorist organisations or directing, which held a very hefty sentence. But the Special Criminal Court was being used a lot for those
look, it was
terrorists.
Effectively unused for...
Well, when it came in initially in 2009, the gangland legislation, I think a lot of the gangs did really get concerned. They thought it was going to be the next cab, basically.
Yeah.
It was going to come at them fast and furious. But there was stories about, they were trying to have tattoos removed if any of those things would link them to gangs. And I suppose Whelan was one of those that really thought, God, they're going after me.
Yeah,
I better get out of the country.
And not incorrectly, they were going after him.
Yeah.
They absolutely were. So we did get out of the country and spend time over in Birmingham for the most part. So he then started reappearing in Ireland in or around the feud as things obviously changed. The feud changed everything for that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you remember, you were writing about sort of the Byrne organised crime group, if you want, before the feud, the year before, maybe 2 years before. And they really were just rolling in money, that organisation. I mean, it was absolutely incredibly lucrative. They really had it down. They had a system down in terms of the money laundering, in terms of the use of cars. They were really absolutely... They were
going to a lot of McGregor fights, I remember.
They were going to a lot of McGregor fights.
Spending a lot of money. And McGregor was kind of like... how long is McGregor really super famous? Like,
well, then you're testing my knowledge. But McGregor became famous really quickly at the start of his UFC career, even without becoming the world champion or things like that. If you remember, he even had a column in the Irish Independent briefly. He was on, and he was on RTE. There was a documentary on RTE.
Yeah,
this is all before he became the world champion. And we, in 2015, for example, he was fighting in Dublin. He wasn't fighting in Dublin, but he was attending fights with David Byrne. This is at the same time that the MGM Marbella, which would become MTK Global, were putting on fights in Ireland, and he was a sort of guest of honor at the front row.
And they were courting celebrity a lot. He wasn't the only celebrity they were honing in on, but there were some links because, of course, McGregor grew up in Drimna.
Yeah,
and boxed.
Well, he grew up in Crumlin. Yeah, and he boxed in the Crumlin Boxing Club, and so did David Byrne.
Yeah.
David Byrne obviously was ultimately the victim of the Regency shooting. He was murdered in the Regency. But they would have...
So they kind of grew up together.
They grew up together. Yeah. And probably even more so, they would have shared a number of associates. One of those associates is due before the courts, so we can't get into his name, but this guy would have been well known to both people. He would have been involved in a broad sense in the criminal underworld, and he would have been very pally with McGregor. Now you have to say...
Yeah, because I might correct you there and just say that he'd be an associate of Byrne, but he would have been a friend of McGregor.
Yes.
There's no suggestion that McGregor has been in business with any of these people involved in the criminal underworld. He's simply, a lot of them, he grew up with them. They went one direction and he went the other.
Absolutely. I mean, nobody has ever suggested McGregor has any involvement in any sort of organised crime, but like in the history of fight sports or combat sports, people have always gravitated towards famous boxers, organised crime figures, not to necessarily even to make money off them, just that's always been the way. I mean, from the early 20th century until now, in America, you've seen it constantly that organized crime figures gravitate towards combat sports, not even for financial gain, but more for a bit of glamour, a bit of
part of their hobby, watching it and everything.
Part of their hobby.
But like back, it would have been in 2014.
Yeah,
there was a guy called Paul Kavanagh who was murdered in Dublin, and his brother Gerard Hatchet Kavanagh had been previously murdered in Spain in a bar in Marbella, Harmon's bar, and that murder would later be linked, and you know the Kinahan organisation would be accused of carrying it out on the orders of Daniel Kinahan. Murky reasons why, but ultimately I've always kind of reckoned he just didn't like him. I don't think Kinahan liked Gerard Kavanagh. Gerard Kavanagh's son was is a well-known boxer, Jamie Kavanagh, and Gerard took his son out to America to train at a time when Daniel Kinahan was setting up his own, you know,
boxing stable
in Marbella, and I always reckoned that was enough, maybe to irritate him enough. You know, maybe anyway.
Yeah, it's a complex history, but I mean, Conor McGregor turned up at the funeral of Paul Kavanagh.
Yeah, because that's what I was wondering. So that was about 2014. So that was a gangland murder. Paul Kavanagh was murdered in Dublin. He was getting out of his car. His partner was nearby at the time. I think he was going back into his house. And it was the second son of the Kavanagh family. It was very tragic for the family. But his funeral was, you know, a normal affair as opposed to some of these big moneyed funerals.
Yeah,
it was a fairly normal affair. But nonetheless, I remember seeing the picture of McGregor in the crowd. And like, that is, you know,
well, I think
quite a story, I'm sure it was at the time.
It was. And I think Conor McGregor was genuinely friends with Paul Kavanagh. I mean, Paul Kavanagh was a sort of unusual murder in the sense that he became a very serious figure in organised crime in Dublin, largely because of his older brother, Gerard Hatchet Kavanagh, who had been, really had become a proper drug trafficker. He's a cousin of Thomas Bomber Kavanagh and had really had a massive patch in the Tallaght area. Paul Kavanagh kind of came in on his coattails to an extent. He was a lot younger, over a decade younger than his brother, and had started to make a lot of money. But he had been a childhood friend of Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor turned up at the funeral. At the time, as you said, it was a very murky business.
And I suppose at the time that big story hadn't broken, because that big story just went like across the globe when this row in the pub happened. And I think, you know, everybody sort of like all those US networks and everything. Like McGregor must have been a bigger star in 2017 than he was in 2014.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was the world champion at that stage, if I'm getting that right.
He'd really hit the big time.
But like, you have to understand, like, McGregor is probably the most famous Irish person in the world.
Yeah.
Like, forget about Bono or Colin Farrell or people. Like, McGregor is just way more famous. I mean, he's on a whole other level of fame.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard for us maybe to appreciate because we remember doing the odd story
but he
about
wasn't,
him.
But that's what I mean. Like, I mean, within those 3 years, like that photograph of him that we had at Paul Kavanagh's funeral, had that been taken in 2017, that probably would have been as big a story as this pub row became.
I mean, I think Conor McGregor became famous gradually and then really quickly, but the fight with Floyd Mayweather really pushed him into a whole other level. This is the professional boxer that he fought. So, like, if you look, I go in and get Google alerts, you know. I won't describe to you, Nicola, how you do it, but you get Google alerts on keywords every day. So you might, like, I have one for Kinahan Cartel, and you might get 2 or 3 hits a day, depending on what's happening.
Yeah.
But on Conor McGregor, you'll get 20 or 30. I mean, there's articles written about him every single time. Yeah. And somebody is going to email in and say the Sunday World is one of the main offenders of Conor McGregor gets a new car or whatever.
Because people are interested.
Because people are interested, but there's interest across the world. He is absolutely way more famous than even we appreciate.
Yeah.
And in terms of social media and all of that. So, but Conor McGregor,
But, you know, he had a bit of fun with that story himself.
yeah,
McGregor, like after that story was that he was going to be killed by the mob and everything, he released a video with a hood up and kind of looking around shiftily.
Yeah.
And I think he knew how ludicrous this was, that he was going to be
and
clipped
then
by the Kinahan cartel. And
and then of course in the space of a short period after, they were pictured, the two men were pictured together.
Yeah, him and Graham The Wig Whelan.
Graham The Wig Whelan.
Because Whelan moved back to Ireland. You were saying, and I think I interrupted you, that the feud changed everything. And Whelan actually came back to Ireland because I think the Kinahan mob as such lost a lot of their top men from investigations that had happened. Many of them were in custody awaiting trial. Some of them had been found guilty. And it left this sort of void at the top of their management structures. And that was the Kinahan organised crime group. And I suppose the Bomber Kavanagh grouping, which, while working together, they were also separate entities.
And certainly
as well.
Becoming more separate as the feud went on.
Indeed, they were, yeah. Even though they were kind of, you know, joining forces as regards trying to
for example, the use of weapons and things like that. But I mean, I think over time they were becoming.
But Whelan moved back and he set up a bin company, and you know, under his own name and everything, his own address. And he had a partner and children, and he was supposed to be moving into, it was green waste, basically. Now, there was no evidence that the company was actually functioning, but nonetheless, he did do that. And he was living back kind of in his own family home where he'd always come from in the first place, in the Drimnagh area. And he was sort of just knocking about, and it wasn't clear what kind of money he was making, or, you know, exactly how much sort of movements in organised crime he was, until he was caught in a hotel in Dublin there was obviously a surveillance operation on him.
Yeah.
And cops burst into this hotel room yet again. You'd have imagined he'd have learned a lesson about being in hotel rooms with anything illegal with him, but he had a Rolex watch on and he was caught with quite an amount of money.
Yeah, I mean, a decent amount of money, a lot more than you or me would carry around. But, in the scale of organised crime, though, not millions in a
45,000 or something.
Yes, so so it's almost spending money.
Yeah,
and that's really how they did operate at the top of the Kinahan cartel. They tended to use these hotels in Dublin 4.
He booked a suite in it for 3 nights or something, and even the payment of the hotel room, he ultimately ended up pleading guilty to saying that, yes, actually the money I used to pay for that hotel room was the proceeds of organised crime. Now, he got lippy, I think, with the police that night. He has a tendency to do that. He's a little bit of a volatile character.
Yeah. Well, are you going to say what he said?
No, I'm way too polite and posh and Southside, but I'll let you say it slightly.
I got this wrong.
Let's all
before.
take a breath.
Yeah. So it was something along the lines of, he was asked, where did you get the money? And he said, up my Swiss roll.
Yeah. So
which is rhyming slang.
Yeah, I get that. No, I do get that. I actually read that before we came on, so I was able to. Yeah, that rhyming slang sometimes is that a Dublin thing? I don't follow it a lot.
It's a London thing, actually.
Oh, is it?
It's a Cockney thing
so
initially.
Swiss roll.
Yeah, up me Swiss
that
roll.
Was a bit Australian, actually. I don't know where that came from.
Yeah, it wasn't authentic.
So he did that, but anyway, he ultimately was brought before the Special Criminal Court, and he got a 3-year or so sentence for these money laundering offences. Now, around this time, you pestilence in the Sunday world were writing about his visitor being Aoife McGregor. That Aoife McGregor was McGregor's obviously sister, very good-looking blonde girl, and she was supposed to be going in and out of the prison according to...
Yeah, so she was. I mean, she was going in and out and visiting him. I mean, Graham Whelan, so we've spoken about his criminal career, like a very serious and lengthy criminal career. However, he did suffer a really deep personal tragedy. His partner and the mother of his 4 kids passed away in very tragic circumstances. And
when did that happen? It was about 2019.
It was in the middle of the proceeds of crime.
The money laundering case. Yeah.
So I mean, that's
and his friend Philip Griffiths, also the same thing happened. He passed away
in very tragic circumstances as well.
They'd been lifelong friends.
And all this was referenced in his court case. You know, in a pretty sincere way. So
I think it was said that he was the caregiver, obviously, for the children, that his wife had passed away, and that he couldn't go to prison basically because he needed to look after them.
Yeah, and during this time, obviously, Aoife McGregor, who again has absolutely no involvement in any sort of criminality, seems to have been a support to him, and he is now out of prison. He made a commitment during his court case that he was putting that life behind him, and they're being photographed again in the photograph we published from the Black Forge pub, her brother Conor's pub. So
he's doing a lot of socialising in that pub, isn't he, Conor McGregor?
Yeah, he's everywhere. I mean, the celebrities just constantly drop up, and he's there, and you know.
So, and this was a kind of a family thing he was having with the family, and Graham Whelan came along to it, and they were photographed together. So they outed themselves as such. They didn't need you guys to keep annoying them. They came out as a couple.
Yeah, and I mean, look, everybody deserves a chance. He's out of prison 2 months, is it now? And he served his time on this occasion, and people deserve a chance to put a new life together, and maybe the tragedies he's experienced will give him a change of mindset.
They were a very ambitious lot, weren't they? All of them, like just the general, the kind of those Crumlin. Like, I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Like McGregor's success, obviously. I mean, you don't get very many people that are that successful like that. They're the biggest sports stars in the world.
You have to remember as well, like, he's not, in terms of financially, he's been an incredible success. I mean, the Proper 12 whiskey and all of that, like, it's put him into another level of wealth. They have been, you're right, they've been very ambitious in terms of it's easy for somebody like McGregor to have made a relatively small amount of money.
But I mean, kind of even like, you know, we're talking loosely that he was childhood friends with some of those guys that went on to become like these mega superstars when it comes to drug dealing.
Yeah.
Like, they were a very kind of unique grouping, maybe, that some of them went into illegal activities, many of them went into legal activities. And I know of other sort of sports stars, in particular one younger guy who's doing really well in a sport as well, and they were just all together. Was there a hunger there, an ambition? Because McGregor wasn't always wealthy. I mean, if you've looked at the documentary, they talk about living hand to mouth himself and
if you look
wife.
at, I mean, no other UFC star has made even a 5-10% of the money McGregor has made, because he has shown ambition. And exactly, maybe if you're surrounding with people with big ambition, it increases your ambition no matter what direction you want to go in.
Yeah.
But it is an amazing story, I suppose.
I was in Arizona last year, and I was in this pretty hick town, like, you know, I mean, hick.
Yeah.
With these sort of strange bars with strange people in them, you know. Now, Arizona's absolutely beautiful, don't get me wrong, but this was kind of a bit of a place you'd want to move out of fairly quickly. But anyway, we stayed there, and the following morning I was grabbing a coffee in this sort of road stop garagey thing. I mean, this is a place you'd blink and you'd miss it, right? And here behind the counter, where they were selling all drink the way we used to have cigarettes displayed, was Proper 12.
Yeah.
And I was looking at it, going, imagine it's here.
Yeah.
I don't know why I thought that, but like, Arizonians are probably big whiskey drinkers, but like, that's the reach of that stuff. Sure, it's for sale across the world.
It is. And
everywhere.
You know, it's been driven by...
And it's priced that kind of, if you're not a whiskey drinker, I like a bit of whiskey, but it's priced that kind of, it's not massive expensive, it's not massively cheap. The bottle looks good.
Yeah.
I haven't partook in it, but...
No, and I mean, some of that has been driven by, you can say, you know, he lived off his celebrity as a fighter, but some of it's been driven by like really impressive social media campaigns. And that's not to say Conor McGregor is obviously a controversial character for other reasons.
And hang on a second, and these kind of stories, like, I mean, these stories drive the fame and the idea that he's, you know, there's this moment of, oh my God, he's going to be killed by the mob, and who are the mob and what are they doing? What's he doing in the middle of that? And so scary, and all the time. He's probably enjoying a little bit of it too.
Well, I'm sure there's some of the stories he hasn't enjoyed.
Yeah.
But he has.
He doesn't care. He doesn't, I don't think he he cares if he's photographed
Well,
with certain people that we're writing about. I don't think he cares because they're just people he grew up with and they were his mates. He doesn't have any interest in what they're doing.
No.
He doesn't have to get involved in it, but they still hang out and have fun.
I think he, you know, if you look at people that are, can we compare them to Harry and Meghan, for example? But like
comparing Conor McGregor to Harry and Meghan.
Well, or somebody like that that really resists that kind of press attention and sort of comes against it all the time. Like McGregor has kind of surfed it in a different way. You know, who's managed to use it to his own advantage, I suppose. So there's different people. There's some people who really back away from it, and there's some people that But I mean, he's become so famous now that those stories are going to keep being written by him, about him, for a long period of time. Like if the Sunday World in 30 years were long gone, they'll probably still be writing the Conor McGregor.
And he doesn't need to do interviews or anything, McGregor. It's just every time he moves.
No, because he does what he does want to get out there. He does it on social media.
Yeah.
Now he will do the odd interview maybe, but
and then he'll have the odd row as well on social media.
And he does interviews with the Sunday Business Post, for example, every now and again.
Does he?
He does. If he buys a new pub or does stuff like that, he'll give a few quotes to the Sunday Business Post. There you go.
Right.
You couldn't get into Sunday Business Post with two.
I actually was in Sunday Business Post years ago. Yeah, I'll have you know. Well, I have it framed. No, I don't. But I was. Interesting. So look, it's just full circle, isn't it? Because, you know, here it is now, and they've taken ownership of this story and they have put out the pictures themselves, the pictures they want used. Yeah. Aoife McGregor and Graham The Wig Whelan. And he looks exactly like a guy who's just been in prison because he's very healthy looking, he's slim, he's obviously been working out. There's very little else to do in prison, but look after yourself. No. So they always usually come out looking pretty fresh. They
looking great.
Yeah.
They really do.
Yeah. We could do it ourselves, maybe.
It could be a makeover, prison makeover.
So there you are, Conor McGregor and the mob, and any other stories we have in relation to that, we'll bring them to you.
Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Niall.